This presentation, I want to talk about design input requirements and integrated set of needs from which they're transformed to form the background of a project for both project management and systems engineering. I don't like to really think about system engineering by itself. I always like to think about project management and system engineering together. They're tightly coupled. We talk about a data and information model of the system of interest that's being developed, final acceptance, certification, qualification. The system's verified against the design input requirements, validated against the needs, and to successfully complete system verification, system validation with any degree of reliability, repeatability, the needs and requirements of the system, as well as system verification, system validation artifacts must be managed over the entire product lifecycle. And so I'm going to talk about a little bit more in doing that. I am co-chair of the requirement working group. Tammy Katz is the chair. We're one of the largest working groups. Last time I looked, we were 397. We have members from all different kinds of industry and academia with the common purpose of improving the practice of system engineering through the improvement of needs and requirements definition management. We have monthly meetings scheduled. If you sign into INCOSE main page, go to your profile at the lower left, browse the working groups, select requirements, and click on join. And this will add you to our mailing list, and you'll receive notifications of all of our upcoming activities. The last 2 months, we've had what we call the Requirement Working Group Exchange Cafe, where we talked about a new product that we're developing. I'll talk about in a minute. On the 17th, we have a presentation by a user talking about his experiences of practice system engineering from a data-centric perspective using a particular set of tools. If you're on this distribution list, then you'll get notification of that. If not, send me information if you want to attend, and I'll send you the Zoom information for that. We have several released products. The Guide for Writing Requirements, the latest version is 2019. It's the gold standard for writing requirements, and I'm a principal author of that. We also have Integrated Data as the Foundation of System Engineering. The white paper focuses on moving from a document-centric to data-centric practice system engineering. We have 3 new products that we're developing: the Needs, Requirements, Verification, Validation Lifecycle Manual, a Guide to Needs and Requirements, and a Guide to Verification Validation. The manual itself is quite extensive. It's like 450 pages. It's designed to be a reference work. System engineering from the perspective of needs, requirements, verification, validation across the life cycle, which is the topic that we're talking about in this presentation. The 2 guides are focused on portions of the manual in a more concise, process-oriented manner. You could go to the guides first, and if you want to know some underlying concepts, then you go to the manual to get a better idea. One thing that I think you all can be proud of in the medical device world is sometimes it's tempting for you to think that you're a subset of system engineering. But to me, in my experience in working in medical device clients, is that the overall processes like that are in Title 21, Part 820 are, to me, equally applicable to all system engineering products, not just medical devices. In the manual, it's heavily influenced by that concept of design inputs and design outputs. It goes throughout the manual as the way to distinguish the two. And one of the big problems in system engineering is a failure to distinguish the two, especially when writing requirements. We have our own YouTube channel. You go to YouTube and search on INCOSE RWG. There's a video on there about the working group. There's a video about integrated data as a foundation of system engineering. And the first part of it is what's in the contents of the white paper. The second part is how to use the white paper to help transition your organization to a data-centric view, and selecting the proper tool sets in a part of that process. This manual, we've recorded briefings from the last IW. You can see the 2 videos on that. One's an overview and contents, one's on some underlying basic concepts. You can subscribe to our channel, and then anytime we put new videos on there, you'll be notified of those new videos. The fundamental thing that we're talking about is, and we call it information-based needs and requirement definition management, but it's really a data-centric practice of systems engineering. We have the needs definition, and there's a whole lot of work that goes into that, coming up with lifecycle concepts, analysis, maturation, developing an integrated set of needs. And I say integrated because we have multiple stakeholders, not just users, but we have multiple stakeholders that are going to have needs, and they're going to be source of requirements. From those needs, we can define what all the functionality we need, all the interactions with other systems, write our requirement expressions, which consists of requirement statements plus a set of attributes. They're going to be verified by your system verification artifacts. and we end up with an engineered system. We have validation against our mission goals and objectives and our integrated set of needs. So all of that is information that is generated throughout the life cycle. All of those things need to be connected within data information model, and traceability is critical to documenting all the relationships of all the artifacts and data information in that model. The concept of design inputs and design outputs, I think, is really important. Too often people want to jump to a solution, put in the how. Throughout the manual, we have the distinction between design input requirements and design output specifications, and then the concept of transformation. And so like from needs transformed into design input requirements, and we have a saying that defining requirements is not an exercise in writing, it's an exercise in engineering. So this engineering analysis takes place to develop that. And then you have the transformation through architecture and design, and you end up with a set of design output specs that you can build code to, and you end up with the system of interest. So one thing I say, instead of focusing just on the users, which is common in the medical device industry, we need to do VOX. What are the voice of all the stakeholders, because they're all sources of requirements. And I really like the fact that the emphasis on both needs and requirements, because we need to understand the stakeholder view, which the customer required, the user's view of the system as if it was a black box. Define that first, and that's what we can validate against. Does it meet its intended use in this operational environment by its intended users? Then the requirements view then is the technical developer view of the system. What does the system need to do to meet the needs? And this distinction surprisingly is not made in a lot of other domains, especially the government contractor kind of world, where all my responsibility is to meet the requirements. It's the customer's job to do system validation, so I'm not going to worry about that. As long as I met the requirements, I can get paid. That's kind of a narrow view of the overall process. In the medical device world, you can't have that view, because it's the validation piece, what's going to get your approval by the FDA. So rather than focusing just on the requirements, let's focus both on needs and requirements. But we also have to be always focusing throughout the life cycle on verification that the requirements are being met, and that the focus on validation, the needs are being met, not just during integration at the end of the development phase, but continuously throughout the life cycle. And so needs, requirements, verification, validation are the common threads that tie all the life cycle activities and artifacts together. And so that's the title of the manual, is to get that crossed. And from a holistic view, the system engineering needs, requirements, verification, validation must be defined and managed in context of all the other process areas, rather than putting stuff in distinct silos. And so we need to be thinking more holistically, managing our system as an integrated system from the beginning, and get rid of a lot of the silos to be successful. It's common in system engineering that we define a system, we decompose it into subsystems, system elements. This works really well, although this view doesn't give you a holistic view of the interaction of all the parts as much as maybe it could. But this is a common way of doing things. Lifecycle concepts, needs and requirements, and that's what the CNR is for all these, need to be defined for every part of the architecture, not just the system level, but every piece that makes up the architecture. We need to go through a lifecycle concept, needs and requirements definition process. When we talk about needs before requirements, there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done first before we define the needs. One thing we're trying to do is establish completeness, consistency, correctness, and feasibility before defining the needs and transforming them into design input requirements. Feasibility is really a key thing when it comes to technology, and that is that technology mature enough. I've seen some startup medical device companies where the real smart scientists had an idea and they wanted to get that implemented right away, but the technology was very immature and they underestimated what it was going to take to mature the technology to be able to actually use it in a product that could be released to the public. And so we need to assess what are the key technologies, what's it going to take to mature the technology such that we can actually use it in a product. We always have risk, regulations and standards, higher level needs, concepts and requirements that we have to be consistent with. We have to interact with existing systems. We always are constrained by cost and schedule. So all this needs to be considered when we're defining our set of lifecycle concepts. Once we have a feasible set of concepts defined, then we can go into define our integrated set of needs. So in the manual, we define this into a series of steps. The section numbers here are sections in the manual. We talk about preparing, selecting a tool, training the people, getting your processes defined, and then to kick off your project, higher level management is probably define the problem or opportunity you're put to address, what the mission goals, objectives, measures of suitability are, and then the project's formed. Then the project's got to go through this process of who are the stakeholders, internal, external, including the users, elicit their needs and requirements. document the elicitation outcomes, identify drivers' constraints, identify the risk, then document all that, and then develop a set of lifecycle concepts. And through an analysis and maturation, you want at least one set of concepts. And then out of that will become people needs, processes, procedures, instructions for use, and then needs for the actual system that we're developing. And then we always want to plan ahead how we're going to validate that the system meets the needs. We need to verify and validate the actual needs themselves, baseline those, and then those are going to feed into our design input requirements and then go into a management process where we manage those needs. There's a lot of iteration that takes place in order to mature our lifecycle concepts. And that's where I think an agile approach is really good, because the team is free to go through several cycles of this, identify what needs to be changed, develop prototypes as they're going through all this process, going into the physical world, identifying critical technologies, assessing the maturity of those technologies. And then when you find the needs, we have a lot of information. And the key thing in a requirement management tool is all this information needs to be captured someplace, and it's not independent of each other. The information is related. And so we need the ability to not only put all this information into the tool, but we need to be able to link related information and manage that in the tool. And then once we have our needs, we can transform those into our design input requirements. So from a verification validation standpoint, we need to validate the integrated set of needs, both that they reflect the intent of all of our lifecycle concept analysis and maturation, but we want to go back to the stakeholders and make sure that we communicated what they need as well. And in INCOSE, we have the business mission analysis and stakeholder needs requirements definition processes that develop all this information. So we need to have traceability back to that. And then verification. In this case, did we develop the needs properly per whatever the organizational requirements for defining needs are, and make sure we did our lifecycle concepts per the processes that we define within our organization for doing that. Then we're going to do in our design input requirements, we have our set of needs, and then we plan for how we're going to develop our design input requirements, transform the needs into the design input requirements. And again, the section numbers cover each one of these topics. It's important that we establish traceability. We have to assess all the interactions between our system and other systems, and that's going to result in our interface requirements. But interface requirements, we also have to define what the interactions are across the boundaries. We have attributes that we're developing for each of our requirements, like rationale, criticality, priority. There's a whole bunch of different attributes. In the guide for writing requirements, and now in the manual, we have a chapter that goes through about 44, I think, different attributes that you can assign and manage for your needs and requirements. And then these can be filtered, create reports, create your dashboard information, help better manage your sets of requirements. And the tools need to support that. And then just like we were planning how we're going to validate the system meets the needs, we need to plan for how we're going to verify that the system meets the requirements. The system verification planning starts right at the beginning. We're going to verify and validate the requirements themselves and baseline the requirements. And then two things going to happen. If we're at the bottom layer of an architecture, we may go straight to design, or we decide we need to further decompose the subsystem. Then we'll do the flow down allocation budgeting, and then we start the whole process over again for the architectural elements at the next level of architecture. And all this, we're managing all this in Section 14 covers that. Once we design something, we go into production. We have the system architecture. We're moving down through the different layers. And this depicts like at the business level, when they're kicking off a project, they're going to have stakeholder needs and requirements. Those are constraints on our system that we're developing. Our job is to transform those into a set of system requirements. But that transformation process, we have to go back and define use cases and so on for our particular system. There's going to be a different set of stakeholders than were maybe used at the previous level. And so we're going to have to engage those stakeholders, like I just talked about, and develop a set of requirements. Then those are going to flow down through allocation to the next level of architecture. Our requirements are going to trace back to their source, the needs they were transformed from, and any requirements that were developed based on the allocated parent requirements at the previous level, we're going to have parent-child traceability. And again, all this needs to be able to be managed within a tool. So requirements at one level are allocated, budgeted. Those are inputs into the concept needs and requirements for the next layer of the architecture. The resulting sets of requirements that are derived from the integrated set of needs. And again, like I said, they're going to be traced. And the process of decomposition then ends when we make a buy, build, code, reuse for that particular subsystem or system element. Now, when we talk about requirements verification validation, we're not talking about system verification validation. We're talking about making sure that the requirements validation, are we building the right thing? Do they really communicate the intent of the integrated set of needs that they were transformed from? From requirements verification standpoint, are they written correctly per the organizational requirements for writing good requirements? So like the INCOSE guide for writing requirements could be what this is, and they're going to drive how we formulate our requirements. I find a lot of people think about requirements verification validation. They think is about verifying that the system meets the requirements, validating the system meets the needs, but that's what we call system verification validation. Requirements verification validation is about the quality of the requirements themselves. Just like needs verification validation is about the quality of the set of needs. And then we get into design, and design is going to go through multiple iterations to implement our requirements, and we'll zero in on design and we'll end up with a physical architecture. And then when we talk about doing verification validation continuously across the life cycle, then we're going to validate that the design output specifications, which represent the design, will result in a system that's the right thing. So do we have the right design? So we go look back at the needs and say, do we have a design that's going to result in those needs being met? We're going to verify that that design represents the design input requirements. Most organizations will keep a track of their best practices, their lessons learned, and that's going to guide how they do design, how they do architecting. And so internal to the organization, there'll be some guidance to the team on how they're going to do that. So you're going to verify that the design met the internal organization's requirements for doing architecting design. This is an important thing for the CAB. The CAB is really putting emphasis on what they call more verification validation on the left side of the V, rather than waiting until you have built your system to see if it meets your requirements or meets the needs. You need to be doing that with your design itself. With the use of models, we were able to create a digital representation of our system. We're able to run tests. We're able to do a certain amount of verification validation using the models so we can fix issues before we actually build and code something. This is going to end up condensing our integration verification validation activities, shortening the time, lower cost, enable us to get to market faster, which I think everyone wants. Once we have our design output specifications, then and we build the system through the implementation integration processes, then we have production verification, which is typically a quality function. Did we build it to spec? Did we build it to drawing? Production verification, did we follow the requirements for how we're going to produce and manufacture? And the FDA is really keen on the production verification part of it because they want to make sure you have a repeatable manufacturing process that will produce your medical devices or pharmaceuticals reliably when you're doing batches. So this is an important part that sometimes system engineers overlook because they say, well, that's a quality function, so that's not my job. Someone else is going to figure that out. But you have to address that in the medical device. And so we included a chapter on this because I think it really is important for all projects, not just medical devices. You've all seen this from the FDA overall guidance document. They clearly define that you have validation against the needs, design output verification against the design input requirements. We take a little bit broader view and say that each of these reviews is actually a verification of validation activity. For every review, we need to make sure, are we meeting the design input requirements? Are we meeting the needs? With this understanding, verification validation is a continuous process across the life cycle. It actually continues after you've released a product for use. System validation doesn't end then. System validation is a lifelong activity that we need to consider. Putting this all together, we have this diagram. So it shows the flow of developing products and the transformations that take place, but it shows the continuous nature of system validation verification. Requirements validation, design validation, system validation. We have requirements verification. We have system verification, design verification, production verification. We have all the verifications that we've followed our internal organizational work instructions processes for doing these activities. And then from a management standpoint, we have all these processes that went through that results in data information that needs to be managed. Part of the prepare for needs requirements validation is having the processes in place, having the tools in place that enable this. We probably went into a little bit more detail than a lot do when it comes to management. We have to baseline our needs and requirements and our design output specifications. We have to have these in a form that can be easily communicated to whoever needs to use these throughout the life cycle. We need an oversight capability as part of management to monitor and control how the needs, requirements, and specifications are actually being developed. We need to manage our system verification validation from the beginning. There's a lot of cost involved in that. I've seen projects crash because they failed to include time in their schedule and money in their budget to do the system verification validation, especially allowing for the unexpected to happen when things may not go right and they have to do rework. Then we have managing change and assessing change. And this is the key thing about all this data and information. How do you manage change if you don't know what everything's linked to, how things are connected, all the interdependencies? And that's a big thing about having a requirement management tool is it allows us to do that. And then we have to manage that control, flow down, allocation, and budgeting, managing the overall process, using allocation traceability to better manage our requirements, and then we have to manage the interfaces. There's a section in the manual on all these topics. This all leads to the need for a robust requirements management tool to manage today's increasingly complex software-centric systems. Organizations need to move from a document-centric to a data-centric practice of system engineering. All that data information, if it was managed in documents, it would be a nightmare. And sadly, there's some organizations still do that. The data-centric practice of system engineering results in a data information model of the system under development, as well as data information model of lifecycle artifacts generated as part of project management and system engineering activities. And so a data-centric practice of system engineering depends on the organization having the tool set that supports data-centric practice of system engineering. And this data centricity is to me what's the intent of MBSE, not developing SysML models. I say SE tool set because of all the stuff that we want to do as part of system engineering, all the different analysis that we want to do. It's hard to find one tool that's really, really good at everything. The jack of all trades, master none. By having this tool set, it enables us to do management and configuration control of all the data and information across the lifecycle, needs and requirements, our verification, validation artifacts, our design artifacts. We can manage all that, our risk. It allows us to manage and assess changes across the lifecycle. Gentry Lee has an old saying, it says, a good system engineer knows the partial derivative of everything in respect to everything. Anything you change across the lifecycle, you need to have the ability to know what the impact of that change is on everything else. Our systems today are getting so complex, there's no way you can do that in your mind. We need a tool that helps us do that. We have risk, and that's an extremely important part of the medical device community. And so we need to be able to manage and control risk across the life cycle, heavily regulated. So we got to enable us to be able to show compliance with standards and regulations, have our single source of truth. And in the medical device world, one of the big things is having a design history file, but there's no reason why with the right set of tools, that design history file cannot be something that's just an output of the data information model. So it's being managed continuously across the life cycle. I think that's a really big advantage of this data-centric practice of system engineering. So to do this, tools have to have key features. One is that rather than managing needs and requirements in a silo, it enables us to manage needs, requirements, risk, verification, validation artifacts in one place across the entire life cycle. Establish end-to-end traceability and data information across the life cycle, support increased collaboration and more effective communications between geographically separated members, allow the data to be shared from one tool to the other, and there's a lot of interoperability standards the tools should support, and allow data to be linked to artifacts generated by other tools. So if I'm developing a SysML model of my system of interest in one tool, and I'm developing requirements in another tool, I should be able to link those requirements to the SysML model. And vendors have done that. There are really good tools that allow us to do that today. The tools have to be quick and easy implementation, like was talked about, a very short learning curve, easy to use, intuitive user interface, customizable by the user to fit the product line and processes, and provide robust reporting and dashboards that provide management insight into the up-to-date status of system development across the lifecycle. This is a short list. In the manual and in the white paper, there's a chapter on features the tool set should have. There's like 40 some features that we list that all support a data-centric practice of system engineering. Questions, comments?